Especially pleased and delighted to be able to welcome our colleague, Professor Colin Coulter, to speak about representations of Northern Ireland in film and in television. And as many of you will know, this is an annual lecture that we run. This is the third time we've run this lecture in memory of our late departed colleague, Dr. Emre Işık. For those of you who didn't know him, Emre was this extraordinary character who came to Maynooth in the early 2000s, worked in the Department of Sociology as a lecturer. I think it's fair to say he fell in love with Ireland. Ireland fell in love with him. He was extraordinarily boisterous and gregarious, but also a real intellectual in that sense that so many people from the great city of Istanbul were and are. And in fact, this morning I had a kind of sad moment where Facebook reminded me that on this very day in 2015, I was with Emre in Istanbul, enjoying his company as everybody did. So we say a special welcome to Emre's family, his wife Catherine in Istanbul, and we are delighted to be able to honor Emre's memory and to continue that tradition that we have established. It's a great personal honor to introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Colin Coulter. I've never had the pleasure of doing this before. Colin, as many of you will know, holds a PhD from Queen's University, Belfast. He came to Maynooth in the mid-1990s and has been a lecturer and latterly professor within the Department of Sociology. His work spans both popular culture and the politics and sociology of Northern Ireland. And I think it's fair to say he has made an extraordinary contribution on both fronts. Recent books, for example, on the Smiths, on the Clash, and on Northern Ireland. He has a new book coming out with Manchester University Press, Northern Ireland, A Generation After Good Friday, written with colleagues that similarly won't need much introduction, Professor Pete Sherlow, Professor Katie Hayward, and Dr. Niall Gilmartin. I'm really looking forward to seeing that book when it is published a few months from now. Now, Colin knows, and many of you may know, I am a great fan of the greatest continuity announcer in the history of television, anywhere in the world, the great Julian Simmons. I've always wanted the opportunity to imitate Julian in my terrible Northern Ireland imitation accent, to say "nigh" on the UTV, but I can say "nigh" at Maynooth University. Delighted to welcome Colin to talk about hauntology, Derry Girls, and representations of Northern Ireland. Colin.
Okay, thanks very much, John, for that very generous introduction. Just also to say, John summed this up very, very well, so I won't add much to it. This is a very sad occasion because, of course, we're marking the passing of a close friend of ours, Professor Emre Işık. And when we were thinking when Emre passed 5 years ago, we're coming up on the 5th anniversary of his death in a month's time. We discussed in the department how we might mark the loss of somebody who was dear to many of us in the department and across several departments in Maynooth. And at the time, the head of department, Professor Mary Corcoran, kindly suggested we have an annual memorial lecture, and I'm delighted that she did, because it gives us an opportunity to say to ourselves, but also to say to Emre's friends and family in Maynooth that Emre was loved, Emre is missed, and Emre will not be forgotten. I want to talk now about Northern, it is, given that this is a memorial lecture, it is, I think the subject matter, what we're talking about today, is rather apt, because of course what I want to talk about today is the passing, those who have passed in Northern Ireland, and perhaps that which never came to pass in Northern Ireland. I want to talk about the ways in which Northern Ireland has dealt with, or more specifically, has not dealt with its own recent violent past. And I want to talk about the ways in which Northern Ireland is represented in both the medium of cinema and the medium of television. And I want to talk about Derry Girls. Just to say to people, it'll be a wee while before we get to Derry Girls. It'll be half an hour or so, so please bear with me, because I want to kind of set out the kind of wider context of why I'm talking about this. Apparently, you know, this what is for many people this very joyous, this very humorous, this very quirkily engaging television program. Why I want to talk about it in terms of notions as grim and as ghoulish as hauntology. So I want to explain that over the next 45 minutes or so. What we're doing in the book is looking at what Northern Ireland looks like, how it has changed and how it hasn't changed over the last 23 years since the Good Friday Agreement. And so let's begin with the Good Friday Agreement, a document which is, of course, much discussed. Oh, this is, yeah, there we go. A document which is much discussed, but of course, rarely read. And the Good Friday Agreement has many attributes. As we know, it's been described as a work of genius by no less a man as William Jefferson Clinton. But despite that, it has, or perhaps because of that, it has many, many flaws. And one of its flaws, of course, is around its the way in which it dealt with the past, or more specifically, the way in which it, and what you can see there is the very opening segments of the Good Friday Agreement, in which the recent violent history of the Troubles, of course, is simply consigned to the past, and we are told that we can best honour those who have fallen through a fresh start. This is what Professor Colin Graham from Maynooth has called the attempted cauterisation of the past, the way in which the Good Friday Agreement had no model for dealing with the past, those who were lost during the past, the abuse of power during the past, those who are left behind because of the violence of the recent past. But of course, cauterisation is a very crude and a very ugly method of dealing with complex societies such as Northern Ireland. And what I want to suggest over the next 45 minutes or so is that attempted cauterisation, that attempt to seal the wound, hasn't worked. And the opening and the constant reopening of the wound is apparent in many ways, but it's apparent not least on the small screen and on the big screen. Back in the first decade after the Good Friday Agreement, many people are interested in the moving image, particularly cinema. There's a lot written about Northern Irish cinema because there is a lot of Northern Irish cinema. A lot of people, Martin McLuhan, Greg McLaughlin, and Steve Baker in particular, suggested that what we saw in the movies that emerged initially after the Good Friday Agreement was a depoliticisation, was a house training of Northern Ireland's recent violent past. What we saw in a space of about 18 months was the emergence, say, for example, of these 4 movies that are in front of us, which you can tell from the posters, from the DVD covers. God, they're so old, it may even be VHS covers, is a different kind of movie to the ones that had previously existed in relation to Northern Ireland. We were used, of course, to the action thriller. We were used to the figure of the chisel-jawed Republican gunman. We were used to men in balaclavas. Those kind of Troubles era thrillers begin to disappear, the likes of Greg McLaughlin and Steve Baker suggest. And what replaced them are movies such as this, rom-coms, romantic comedies. What were previously movies about men in balaclavas essentially become movies about the ordinary folk of Northern Ireland going about their everyday lives. Movies that were previously set on the kind of the back lanes, so the country lanes and the back alleyways of Belfast and Northern Ireland become movies that are essentially about consumption, about the private spaces of the home, about the public spaces of the new shiny cathedrals of consumption in Belfast, Derry and elsewhere. And you see this important shift in the way in which Northern Ireland is represented on the big screen, the emergence of this new generation of the romantic comedy. And what they suggest, McLuhan and McLaughlin and Baker, what they suggest is this is part of this depoliticisation, this attempt to cauterise the wound, this attempt essentially to draw a line in the sand and to leave the Northern Irish Troubles behind. Now, that was never really entirely true, because during this period of the first decade after the Good Friday Agreement, there were always movies that were darker in tone, more melancholy in tone, looking back towards the conflict. There was, of course, Bloody Sunday. There was, of course, Oma. There was, of course, H3. Even a lovely little coming-of-age drama, such as Mickey, Bo and Me, about two wee boys from across the sectarian divide who fall in love with their common heroes, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, is haunted by the ghostly figure of Mickey Bo's father, who of course dies in one of the many atrocities perpetrated by loyalist paramilitaries during the conflict. So even during this first decade after the Good Friday Agreement, this kind of new generation of the rom-com, which very much depicts, for example, Belfast. Belfast had always been a pariah city before, in the words of Martin McLuhan, but now it became this kind of commercial city of glass, in the words of Declan Long. But even during that period, you have other versions of movies that are much darker and who kind of hark back towards the bad days of the Troubles. But over a period of time, what the likes of McLaughlin and Baker were suggesting was that over time, essentially, cinema would move on. We wouldn't get these kind of movies that were melancholy and dark and dealing with the events and the personalities and the atrocities of the conflict. And this had a certain logic to it. It's precisely what happened, for example, in the realm of popular music. If you go back to the period of the Northern Irish Troubles, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of songs written about the Troubles, but that very much ends around the time of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, and only really reappears perhaps in the last 5 years or so. This isn't really what happened with Northern Irish cinema and with Northern Irish television. What I want to suggest is that certainly from around the 10th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, what we see is an acceleration, a proliferation, I should say, of these rather darker, more melancholy, more haunted, more hauntological versions of Northern Ireland on the big screen and the small screen. And what I want to do in today's talk is to kind of provide some evidence for that, but also to provide a conceptual framework in which to explain that. There's a strange coincidence from a distance. Those of us who follow Northern Irish politics, even those of us who don't follow Northern Irish politics, will remember this infamous moment in the Great Holland Stormont in May 2007, when the deal is done that nobody thought could ever be done, when the former Chief of Staff of the Provisional IRI sits down with the very embodiment of fundamentalist unionism, and they strike a deal. This is, south of the border, the moment at which people begin to forget about Northern Ireland, only to be rudely awakened, of course, with the Brexit referendum. People south of the border think that things are really on the mend now, things are on the up now, and essentially all of the post-Good Friday Agreement disagreements are going to disappear, and we're going to move towards the sunny uplands, to coin a phrase, of the bright new Northern Ireland. That isn't how things were going to turn out. And of course, we have a premonition of that in the movies and latterly of the television programs that begin to emerge after the 10th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. That appears like an irony. Just as the Northern Irish problem seems to be solved, just as Northern Ireland just seems to be getting on its feet, scriptwriters for television and cinema begin making a stream of movies that are profoundly haunted, that are hauntological, and I'll explain what I mean by that term in a few moments. We shouldn't be surprised by this. The appearance of these moving images was at one and the same time an admonition and a premonition. An admonition in the sense that Avery Gordon says that the ghost, the spectre, that which is past, that or who is no longer with us, doesn't like to be ignored. It has a real presence and it demands its due. It demands your attention. And one of the things that's very obvious from around 2008 on, I'll talk about why it's 2008 on in a wee moment. What's very, very obvious is that the ghosts of Northern Ireland's past become much more insistent about our attention. So it's an admonition about that attempt to cauterize our past, to close it off, to seal it off, to draw a line under it. It's also a premonition, and it's a premonition specifically of the problems that are going to arise specifically because the Northern Irish political settlement never had a model for dealing with the past. There was no truth or reconciliation process, and of course, until this very, very moment, we are maybe 6 weeks away from finally the victims of the Troubles getting their pensions. Fingers crossed. Hopefully it'll happen, but of course, you don't have to be a cynic to assume that it may well not happen. So what we have here is an admonition and a premonition. An admonition that this really needed to be sorted out, and a premonition that it was going to create all manner of devilment. And that is precisely what it did in the period when the DUP and Sinn Féin go into power. It is one of several issues that bedevil and undermine and eventually bring down that the strange bedfellows that were and are the DUP and Sinn Féin in government. So about 18 months ago, on sabbatical leave, I'm watching a lot of movies, I'm watching a lot of TV programs, and a lot of them just seem profoundly bleak, profoundly melancholy, profoundly haunted. And I thought, I need to frame this in some way. I can describe it. It's there in front of me. It's just leaping out at you. But I needed some conceptual framework in which to explain what it was that I was seeing. And the notion of hauntology, which has come to the fore, it goes back several decades, but it's come to the fore in the last decade, seemed the most obvious way of framing the discussion of these television programs and indeed these movies. So, that notion of hauntology, where does it come from? Well, many people, certainly the literature on post-conflict trauma, quite often regard as its point of origin, is the work of Nicholas Abram and Maria Torek. They don't use the term, they never use the term hauntology, but they're quite often regarded as the progenitors, as the grandparents of this particular notion. And what they say in their work, two Hungarian emigre psychoanalysts working in France, come up with this notion that we are haunted, but we're haunted by the previous generation, or the generation before that we inherit trauma from previous generations. The notion of the phantom, Nicholas Abram comes up with, and they begin to share this notion of the phantom. We are haunted by something, some unresolved business of a previous generation, some unresolved trauma of a previous generation that we do not know that we have inherited, and we do not know the precise nature of. That's all conveniently vague. That's all very psychoanalytic. As a sociologist, it's interesting, it's fun to read, but it didn't make an awful lot of sense in terms of how I was going to describe the culture of contemporary Northern Ireland. We take it forward half a generation, and of course, this notion gets a name, and the notion of hauntology comes from Jacques Derrida. Jacques Derrida, in his book Spectres of Marx, which I have to be honest with you, I can make neither head nor tail of other than this, that he says that what we have in the post-Cold War world, he's essentially writing about Marx after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the collapse of Stalinism, and he says that we live in a world of melancholia. I'll talk a little bit about melancholia in a moment. We live in a world of melancholia. And the reason we live in a world of melancholia, of hauntology, is because of a moment of loss signified by the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that moment of loss wasn't the loss of the Stalinist tyrannies. It was the loss of the idea of a progressive future that originally was embodied in what became the Stalinist tyrannies. That what happened when the Berlin Wall came down, what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed, was that people on the left lost the idea of a better future. And we mourn for that loss of a better future. We mourn in the form of hauntology. So he introduces this notion of hauntology, which is this clever, perhaps not so clever, play on the philosophical term ontology, which is a state of being. And of course, ontology and a hauntology, if you're French, are pronounced precisely the same way. So he says we exist in this hauntological state, the state of mourning, the state of melancholy, because we've lost something. But it's not something from the past, it's something from the future, right? We've lost something, not something that existed, but something that could have existed. And one of the few things that made sense to me was the introduction of course, one of the great thinkers who himself had a vocabulary that was rich in references to death, the undead, the vampiric, the undead nature of labor, and so on. Of course, Karl Marx. And Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the most famous use of the term spectre in the English language is, of course, the opening line of the Communist Manifesto of 1848, which reads, as you all know, that a spectre is haunting Europe. It is the spectre of communism. And this is an interesting notion because, of course, what Europe, bourgeois Europe, is being haunted by is not something that it has existed, not something that exists. It is something which is a prospect. It is something that may come to exist. And of course, Marx believed as night follows day, it really would exist. In other words, what Derrida draws our attention to is something that should really be obvious, which is that the notion of the spectre is not merely about what is past. It is about that which is yet to come, the past. Of course, any of us watching A Christmas Carol will know this because Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. But when I use the term the spectre in this lecture, that's what I mean. Something that is multi-temporal, something that is that no longer exists and has not yet come to exist. Martin Hoagland, writing by Jacques Derrida, says that he draws this distinction. What Derrida is interested in is the no longer and the not yet. So that's what I'm interested in, that spectres haunt us, but in haunting us, the spectral in our lives is not simply that which we have lost. It's that which we hope to have and never quite acquired. Why that's significant for Northern Ireland, we'll come back to again in that wee moment that never quite seems to arrive. Now, reading Abrams and Torok, I must say, left me a wee bit bewildered. Derrida left me believing I had very little grasp of the English language. The person who brings all of this together, the person who puts it into plain English, is somebody who's put many things over the last 10, 12 years into plain English for many of us. It is, of course, the late, lamented in some quarters, but not every quarter, Mark Fisher. And Mark Fisher, in his book Ghosts of My Life, of course, a reference to the Japan single, which strangely charted about 40 years ago, writing about depression, hauntology, and lost futures. And he says that the world of what he calls famously late capitalism is hauntological. It is pervaded by a sense of melancholia. And of course, what he means by melancholia in this context draws upon a famous distinction by Sigmund Freud. Freud draws a distinction between mourning and melancholia. And what he means by this is mourning is that intense period of grief by which we learn to give up the ghost, by which we learn to get over the loss, by which we learn to relinquish the love object, the person or the thing that it is that we loved but is now gone. Melancholia is rather different. It's a period of grieving which is less intense but more prolonged. But rather than giving up the ghost, rather than relinquishing the past, melancholia specifically entails an unwillingness to relinquish it, an unwillingness to give up on the lost love object. And what we do is, in our melancholia, is we absorb it into ourselves. We incorporate it into ourselves and how we think about ourselves. And this expresses itself, this prolonged grieving expresses itself in pathologies, particularly in forms of self-loathing. And Mark Fisher sees this melancholia everywhere in popular culture in the moment of late capitalism, this moment where there appears to really, he says, where we're told there really is no alternative. Where in particular he sees it is in popular music which was once known for its facility to engage and enrage, was known for its facility for future shock. In the 21st century is very much reduced, not to breaking boundaries and breaking taboos, but simply retreading, reissuing and repackaging its own glorious past. He says that is its profound melancholia, its inability to let go of its own glorious past, expressed in its own inglorious, repetitive, nostalgia-soaked present. But in the midst of all of this nostalgia, all of this melancholia, all of this inability to move on, Mark Fisher sees something progressive. And in particular, what it is versions of avant-garde electronica, many of them associated with the appropriately titled Ghost Box record label. And he says in these versions of what he calls hauntological electronica, right, what we see is a version of nostalgia which could be progressive, right? And what he means by that is simply this. He says that what characterizes this hauntological music, this haunted music, this electronica, is an obsession with an analog past. In particular, an obsession, a fetish with the sound that the stylus makes, that lovely sound. Many of us record from previous days, that sound of the ghost, that sound of the stylus on the vinyl. And he says that that version of hauntological music, which is nostalgic, it's nostalgic for the past, the analog years of distant decades, but it's also nostalgic for the future. Because what those people are nostalgic for is not that version of social democracy that existed before the neoliberal revolution. It was the potential for a better society that existed in the core of social democracy before the rise of neoliberalism. In other words, what people are haunted by is not what is past, but that which never came to pass. What we're haunted by is not merely the no longer, but by the not yet. So that's the kind of conceptual framework I'm using. That's why I think Mark Fisher is an interesting person to watch Northern Irish movies, and specifically Derry Girls with, which we'll come on to in about 10 minutes' time. So if you're a wee bit bewildered by that, let's sum up. What I'm really interested in here is the notion that Northern Ireland is haunted, and it's haunted by a spectre, but the spectral is not merely that which has no longer exists, it is also that which has yet to come to exist. It's not merely a lost past, it is a lost future, okay? So I want people to bear in mind as we go through that. Reading Mark Fisher's Ghost of My Life, the thing that Fisher does, there's not very much in what he says which is original, but what he does, of course, is he has a great eye for the metaphor, he's a great eye for the example, and he's a great eye for taking complex and quite often impenetrable ideas and turning them into something that you can see in everyday life. And what I was seeing 18 months ago was, after reading Ghosts of My Life, was what I was watching on the big screen, on the wee screen, was the haunted nature of Northern Irish society, or more specifically, the hauntological nature of Northern Irish society, the way it is troubled by the troubles, but it's also haunted by its lack of a future, or lack of a future that once existed a generation ago, right? That sounds like a very bleak, very mournful claim, and I want to explain why I'm making it through the medium of popular moving images of cinema, and I will say popular music there, because that's what I'm used to saying. It strikes me from around 2008. 2008 is, of course, the year, people don't remember this quite often, when Ian Paisley is ousted as the head of the Free Presbyterian Church and the DUP simultaneously, and is replaced by Peter Robinson. In the summer of 2008, there's a very different version, a very different coupling at the helm of Northern Irish politics. It isn't the Chuckle brothers, it is Martin McGuinness and the rather more taciturn figure of Peter Robinson. And of course, they would have a very fractious and very problematic relationship in all sorts of ways. And I started watching movies from this period. And if there is a movie that begins this proliferation of haunted, mournful, melancholy, moving images about Northern Ireland, it is an obvious one. What better day, or what worse day, to be talking about these things today is, of course, the 40th anniversary of the death of Bobby Sands, as most people will know. And of course, the movie that I'm talking about here is a movie which is certainly the most revered, and in some quarters the most reviled, of the post-conflict generation in Northern Ireland. I am, of course, talking about Hunger, hugely critically acclaimed movie. I think without question, not that the competition is particularly stiff, without question, the greatest movie to be made about Northern Ireland post-conflict. Many people have seen it. If you haven't, you have to go and see it. Not on the first date, obviously, but it is certainly one of those movies that everybody has to see, harrowing as it is. And what I was interested in, watching Hunger many times over the years, trying to look at it through the lens, what would Mark Fisher say about a movie like that? And what I was interested in is the reception of that movie in particular, because for all the accolades, of course, it has had many barbed comments as well. I'll just put these up, I won't dwell on them. This is very typical of the representation of the kind of critical reception of those people who do not like hunger. A love letter to Bobby Sands, says Chris Tukey, with no sense of irony, writing for the Daily Mirror, the Daily Mail, of course, under the headline of more pro-terrorist propaganda from the newspaper that stoutly opposed the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, and all of the rest of them. I jest. Killian McGrattan, a repoliticizing propagandistic exercise in myth-making. This was the critique, that this was a film about a real historical event that took sides, that it glamorized the death of Bobby Sands, that it mythologized the death and the figure of Bobby Sands. Fintan O'Toole makes a rather more subtle version of the same argument, but it is very close to the same argument. So that was the critique of hunger, about its specificity, about essentially that it was a politicized and a biased recollection of what is, after all, one of the biggest traumas of the Northern Irish conflict. You know, among many, it's quite clearly one of the biggest traumas of the Northern Irish conflict. But what was interesting was the terms on which people defended hunger. People who weren't necessarily of a Republican disposition. And the way in which people defended hunger was referring to its universality, was by suggesting, yeah, okay, maybe this is a movie about Northern Ireland, but it's about the world. It's about the human condition. It's about resistance to political oppression. It's about the nature of political incarceration in so many places. Steve McQueen, of course, the director, made this claim time and time and time again. I read loads and loads of interviews, and he said, this isn't a political movie. This is a movie about the human condition. And if it is a political movie, ironically, contradicts himself a little bit. If this is a political movie, it's a political movie that's meant to remind people that what happened in Her Majesty's Prison, Long Kesh, the maze, is something which is happening today in a post-Iraq war world, is happening in Guantanamo Bay and in Abu Ghraib in Baghdad. So he very much defends it on the grounds of this is meant to teach us something. This is meant to recall something that is a much more universal story that might be tethered in Northern Ireland, but is about something much more global. What we find is a number of people trying to kind of come to his defense. John Lynch, for example, says something so absurd, it barely requires any effort to reveal its absurdity. He says, McQueen has made a movie that's not really about Bobby Sands at all, which of course is ridiculous. You know, the text on the screen tells us it's about Bobby Sands. The character is Bobby Sands. This is not a movie about somebody who looks like Bobby Sands in conditions similar to Bobby Sands. This is precisely a movie about Bobby Sands. But what was interesting, it was probably in a strange way the most interesting thing I read of all the dozens of things I read while trying to think about something that I never really thought about before, was by a woman called Rebecca Graf McRae. And she posed this question. And she posed the question, why is it that the Republican movement are not particularly rapturous in the reception, she claims, towards hunger? Here you have the biggest Republican icon, the biggest martyr on the big screen all across the world, and it's being received rapturously. And what she suggests is there's a certain reticence here in the Republican movement. There's a certain ambivalence here towards this great movie, Hunger. And what she says is it's because it's a universal film, that it's a film that might be about Northern Ireland, but is about everywhere else at the same time. And because of its universality, Sinn Féin, the Republican movement, cannot claim it as its own. She asks the right question, but she offers precisely the wrong answer. When she asks, why are Republicans uneasy with this? I think you have to understand the nature of the spectre that Bobby Sands is. Bobby Sands is both the no longer and the not yet for the Republican movement. He is, of course, the great Republican martyr. He is the embodiment, unfortunately, the disembodiment of the valor, of the fortitude, of the conviction of the Republican movement. This is a man who starved himself to death after 66 days without eating any food. He is, of course, the great hero, the great emblem of what Republicans conceive as their own glorious past. But he's also something else. He's also a guilty reminder of how far the Republican movement has moved, or some would say fallen from, its original lofty ideals. The Republican movement has attempted to fold Bobby Sands and his death into a wider teleology, a wider story, which leads seamlessly from the H blocks to the Great Hall of Stormont. The death of Bobby Sands is taken as that moment of protest and resistance that was the catalyst that allowed the Republican movement to grow legs and become a popular mainstream force that ultimately would negotiate the Good Friday Agreement and end up with its seat under the table, its feet under the table of power in Northern Ireland. But of course, there's a problem with that, which is that Bobby Sands was not a pacifist. This was not the teleology that he wanted. Bobby Sands wasn't looking for equal rights for nationalists, although he was looking for that. He wasn't looking for Sinn Féin members around the table at Stormont. He was looking for a conflagration. He was looking for an acceleration of existing conflict. He wasn't looking for the peaceful resolution of that conflict. He was looking for its acceleration into a higher level of war. And it's one that he got. 30,000 plastic bullets are fired in 3 months after the death of Bobby Sands. So Bobby Sands is the hero figure of the Republican movement. He's also a deeply, deeply troubling figure for the Republican leadership because, of course, he is the martyr who fell, who sacrificed himself for the community. But he's also the person who sacrificed himself for the community in an attempt to create a socialist united Ireland, which of course we're very, very far from. So while he is both the great martyr hero figure, he's also the spectre at the feast of modern republicanism. He is a spectre in both senses. He is the no longer, the person whose body consumed itself after 60 days, but he's also the embodiment, the disembodiment of the not yet. He's the person that reminds Republicans that what they wanted, they haven't got, and they possibly may never get. So he's recalled with great honor and great valor, but he's also somebody who pricks the guilty conscience of many people in the Republican movement. I'd imagine one in particular, given the revelations of today. I think there's one person, or perhaps one person and his teddy bear, who perhaps feel especially troubled by the spectre that is Bobby Sands. In other words, when we watch Hunger, what we're watching is a spectral figure who represents not only that which was lost, not only that which passed, but also that which never came to pass. It represents the lost past of Northern Ireland, but also its lost future, a better future that was never realized. And to be honest, it's all there in the text. It's all there in the movie. Because one of the things that is often not mentioned is the figure of Bobby Sands' younger self. Here he is as a 12-year-old running along the towpath. He tells the story, of course, about as a kid, he goes to a cross-country meet up in Donegal, and warming up, he sees a wee foal in a stream, and of course, to put it's got a broken leg, and to put it out of its misery, of course, he puts its head under the water and drowns it and gets into huge trouble. This is one of the mythologizing moments where Bobby Sands no longer becomes simply a member of the Republican movement. In the words of Debbie King, he becomes the heroic figure who rides alone, much beloved of Hollywood scriptwriters. But when we watch the wee lad running along the towpath, as Bobby Sands breathes his last, the wee lad stops and he looks back. He then runs on. And what it suggests to me, of course, is the story of Bobby Sands runs on, that it has an afterlife or several afterlives. And of course, those afterlives are deeply controversial, and they're deeply controversial, not least today. So what struck me is, if you want to understand why this movie is so controversial and so deeply troubling for at least some within the Republican movement, you have to understand that the spectre is not merely the no longer, it is also the not yet, that which is past and that which has never come to pass. We sip of tea, excuse me. Okay. It strikes me that Hunger marks a moment after which there is a proliferation of movies and eventually television programs that have this deeply, deeply haunted kind of nature. We see, for example, I mean, it's one of the strange things about what's happened in Northern Ireland after the Good Friday Agreement. The further we get away from the Troubles, the more troubled we are by them. The further we get away from the Good Friday Agreement, the more we want to talk about the past. Bobby Sands today, of course, the death of Joe McCann yesterday, the Ballymurphy massacre tribunal going on, the Birmingham pub bombings tribunal, presumably at some stage will gather steam. And what we see is a sequence of movies. Here's 3 movies, major international movies shown around the world that appear in the space of about 5 years. And of course, what they have in common is that in all of these movies, one of the principal characters are British military intelligence, the informants who they enlist. It's very much about the intelligence community. And of course, these figures are ghosts, the very definition of the ghost. That which is both here and not here at the same time, which is precisely what British military intelligence is, very much there, working behind the scenes, who are officially, it is said, do not exist, but of course have their fingers all over the Northern Irish conflict. And what you see, particularly, I think people's interest piqued by the revelations about Freddie Scappaticci, is the sequence of movies. The most recent is 71. This, again, critically revered box office success about a young British private who loses his way on his first day in West Belfast trying to get back to his barracks. And of course, he stumbles across, in a loyalist bar, he stumbles across members of the military reconnaissance force priming a bomb for loyalists to plant in a Republican bar. The bomb detonates and Hook stumbles. Amazing scene. Hook stumbles, and of course the muffled soundtrack reflects the fact, of course, that his eardrums have been burst, and through the gloom the small child beckons to him, and of course it is the ghost of the wee lad who's just been dismembered, whose dismembered body he's just dragged from the rubble. What you see as these movies beginning to emerge, they're about the role, the nefarious role of British military intelligence in the Northern Irish conflict. And of course these people are ghosts. They're both there and not there at the same time. And of course, what are they called? In common parlance, they're referred to precisely as spooks. And what we see is the sequence of movies. 5 Minutes of Heaven was made for television, but is essentially a movie, which is a pretty stinging rebuke to the reconciliation industry. Liam Neeson, of course, former UVF man who murdered the elder brother of James Nesbitt, and for the television cameras are being brought together to talk about the possibility of resolution in Northern Ireland, although James Nesbitt has a secret longing, a secret plot, of course, to murder the man who took his brother's life for no apparent reason in Lurgan in the early 1970s. If you see The Dig, for example, this incredible movie that got very little traction, which is about the attempt to excavate the remains of a disappeared woman presumed to be buried on a bog, and it's set in Northern Ireland. The livery of the police cars is the PSNI, but somehow, strangely, all of the major characters have Southern Irish accents. They're all from Dublin and Waterford, and they all speak with their natural accents, their native accents. And we have this strange movie about the disappearance of somebody who might be buried in a secret grave, a disappearance of somebody from Northern Ireland who's buried in a secret grave, but somehow, through their accents, were transported south of the border. Hard to watch that movie without thinking of the disappeared, 3 of whom the remains have never been returned to their loved ones. And of course, most recently, Lost Lives, which did something which people previously thought was impossible. To take a book of 1,700 pages documenting the deaths of everybody whose life was claimed during the Northern Irish conflict, and to make it, to put it onto originally the big screen and then onto television. And it's something that kind of treads the boundary between art house cinema and documentary. So what we'll have from about 2008 on is a sequence of movies that are just so profoundly haunted, that suggest that we're still troubled by the Troubles, as of course we should, that we're haunted by these spectres. Television takes much longer to catch up. Here's 3 television series from the last few years. And one of the things that's interesting, it's about younger people growing up in Belfast and Northern Irish people growing up in London. And one of the things that's interesting is how the Troubles is not erased, but is certainly turned down in the mix. In 6 Degrees, for example, sadly neglected, fantastic wee series put out by BBC Northern Ireland. 6 students from England, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland negotiate their way through their undergraduate degrees in Belfast. We see them rarely on campus. We see them mainly as consumers and workers in the nighttime economy. The Troubles doesn't exist in this. There's one reference to kneecapping, which is made even the more incongruous by the fact that it comes from the lips of the posh, elderly, eccentric who lives across the road from the students. London Irish, of course, Lisa McGee's ill-fated first kind of solo writing project about Northern Irish people living in London, as the title would suggest, of course, has moments and the set pieces in the bar where there's references to Northern Ireland to set up some of the lamer jokes in the programme about we're no longer considered terrorists. They have new terrorists now. They have better looking terrorists. And of course, one of John's favourites, My Left Nut, where Mick the wee lad in the front, originally a stage play put on television. We're just on to one of your favourites here, John, My Left Nut, about Mick who finds that his swollen testicle might be cancerous. And this programme has a running gag about the conflict. The one of Mick's friends, his dad is in the RA, is a member of the Provisional IRA, and of course, with crushing inevitability, it turns out that the father happens to hail from the Unionist community. What we see in some of these programmes is a kind of erasure of Northern Ireland's past. I mean, certainly 6 Degrees in particular is a programme that, if you take the accents out, could really have been made. It's made in Belfast, but it could have been made in Brighton or London or Edinburgh or Dublin for that matter. So what you have in contemporary Northern Irish television, in part, is an erasure of Northern Ireland's past, to the point that you can actually now make a programme about Northern Ireland set in Belfast, set in working class Belfast, that has no reference to the Troubles and has no reference to the sectarian fissures that still run through the city. Come Home, really interesting programme. Christopher Eccleston tries out his Belfast accent for size, not for the first time, not for the last time, it doesn't quite work, but he makes a decent stab at it. And he is the father of kids. The mother of the family has suddenly and unexpectedly left, and he's trying to put their lives back together. That whole problem, that whole programme, is not a single reference to the political specificities in Northern Ireland, the troubled northern past of the 6 counties and so on. So what you have in television is this kind of interesting thing, which is that it's not that the past has been erased, but it's become, it's certainly beginning to be airbrushed out of the picture. And what you see is this ironic reversal. Back during the Troubles, and even since the end of the Troubles, if you wanted to make a feature film about Northern Ireland, if you want to make a feature film about Belfast, you had to set it elsewhere. You know, I think some of the big crowd scenes, of course, in Some Other's Son, the kind of anti-H block kind of demonstrations, I think were filmed in Ballymun, for example. But what's happened in Northern Ireland is that in some television, the erasure of the past has got to the point where Belfast can now actually stand in for other cities. Where previously people had to go elsewhere to film Belfast, people come to Belfast to film elsewhere. Paula, for example, didn't really make much of a splash. It's a very, very dark program about essentially a controlling and violent man controlling the title character at the forefront there. Of course, more recently, the hugely and inexplicably popular Line of Duty, which is set in an unspecified, unnamed English city, is of course filmed in its entirety in Belfast. And of course we could add to the list, I haven't put up there, we could add to the list, the most famous of all, that Dungeons and Dragons malarkey that people used to go on about an awful lot, and thankfully people have begun to stop talking about it. So what we have when we look at Northern Irish television is this gradual erasure of the past. Almost when you watch Northern Irish television, you think, well, finally we're beginning to come to terms with this, you know, that we have cauterized the past. You know, we've put it in its box. Belfast can stand in. Belfast is now just another 24-hour kind of modern late capitalist city and all of the rest of it. But then 3 television programs kind of queer that pitch. 2 are very obvious, and the third one is the one I'm sure people are waiting desperately for me to talk about, and I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. The 2 obvious ones, the program that really starts this, if you could say that this is a thread or a trend, the program that certainly starts it is The Fall. The Fall, when first broadcast in 2013, was the most successful television program that BBC Two had for over a decade. It tells a story that is both universal, in particular universal in the sense that it is another story about the serial killer claiming the lives of young women, but it takes that universal story and it places it in a very specific context, that of post-conflict Belfast. And one of the many problems with The Fall, or probably its principal problem, is the screenwriters don't really see, the scriptwriters don't really seem to know what to do about the connection between these two different parts of the story. About halfway through, almost arbitrarily, it's a real sudden kind of changing of the gears. The story of the main male protagonist, the serial killer there, the person who was born as Peter Baldwin, gets brought into the story as a backstory, as explanatory. Why is this man killing these women, these young women, their early 30s, professional backgrounds, dark-haired, and so on. And it emerges that the person, the wee boy who was born Peter Baldwin, was the fruit of the union between a visiting British squatty and a working class Catholic one, a mixed relationship, which, as we all know, was deeply, deeply dangerous in the context of the Troubles. The squatty leaves, the wee lad has a adopted father, but of course he leaves as well, and his mother claims his own life. This miserable backstory. By the age of 8, Peter Baldwin ends up in the residential care sector, in residential homes, and as we know from 2 reports in the last 4 years in Northern Ireland and recent reports in Southern Ireland, we know the horrors that were visited upon children. He was deemed by one particular paedophile priest as being a particularly pretty boy, and he was the principal sectarian prey of that priest for an entire year. This is introduced as the backstory, as the possible explanation of why this is going on. And of course, what there's an attempt to do is to take this universal, contemporary, popular story and to connect it to Northern Ireland's troubled past. Because of course, in Northern Ireland, when we think of residential homes, we think of one in particular. We think of Kincora. We think of that boys' home in East Belfast, where members of the, even by loyalism standards, the more exotic strands of that particular political affiliation preyed on young boys with the knowledge, collusion of British military intelligence, presumably because it was in the vested interests of British military intelligence. So what we have in this program, of course, is a spectre of Northern Ireland's past, and of course, just to mark, just once, the excruciating pun of the serial killer's adopted name, he is, of course, Paul Spector. More recently, we have had Bloodlands, featuring the criminally underemployed James Nesbitt, who appears in about a dozen of the movies and TV programs that I've just mentioned that many people will have seen over the last few weeks. If you haven't seen it, don't. That's 4 hours of your lives you're never getting back. But the only thing that's of interest to us here is, of course, the tagline, the past isn't dead. This is essentially about 4 unsolved murders that happened immediately before the Good Friday Agreement. Again, another kind of reiteration of the fact that Northern Ireland is still coming to terms with the version of itself that existed before the 10th of April, 1998. The past isn't dead, it's still very much with us, which of course is true. So finally, you'll all be relieved to know, those of you who remain, those of you who haven't dozed off, we're on to Derry Girls. I'm not going to say too much about Derry Girls. We'll be done in under 10 minutes, and I'm going to take a wee rest. I'm going to give my throat a wee rest, and I'm going to show you a couple of clips from Derry Girls. What to say about Derry Girls? Derry Girls, of course, hugely popular, the most popular television program on Channel 4 over the last decade, picked up by Netflix and so on. There's many things we could say about it. The thing that people talk about most is its gentle, idiosyncratic humour. It's hard to imagine, and it draws very much on the local idiom, draws from very much the local patterns of speech, the local sense of humour, which is very different to Belfast. Everything pretty much is set in Belfast, and this is a refreshing attempt to draw a bit of attention to Northern Ireland's second city. And of course, it's hard to imagine a Belfast Girls. The sense of humour is so incredibly different. In Belfast, it's pitch dark. You know, there isn't any humour in Belfast in which somebody doesn't end up as a victim. This is much more light, much lighter. It's worked with an international audience. It's worked with a British audience. It's worked with a Southern Irish audience because it draws on that local idiom. But it's also, of course, nostalgic. This is rooted in Lisa McGee's own experience of coming of age at the end of the Northern Irish Troubles. The programme documents, of course, the ceasefires, the coming to Belfast and Derry of the world's principal arms dealer, William Jefferson Clinton, to tell everybody to take the gun out of Northern Irish politics. And it documents this particular moment in her life and the life of the society of which she was and is part in beautiful detail, the chart hits of the day and lots of period detail which enliven it. I'm going to show you a wee clip now, which I think for many people is what charms them. It didn't charm me initially, although it did on reviewing. This is about what is it? It's about 2 or 3 minutes into the pilot episode, and there's a bomb scare. In most societies, this, of course, would be a matter of consternation, a matter of some fear, but of course, everybody takes it as, at worst, a minor distraction. And of course, for the fantastic character of Aunt Sarah, the fantastically absorbed Aunt Sarah, it means that this bomb scare might come between her and a very important tanning appointment. Please enjoy this.
Look at this, the bomb on the bridge, apparently.
No.
Suspicions were raised when a hijacked van...
Oh, dear God, no. Does this mean they can't get to school? I've had a whole summer of it, Jerry. She's melting my head.
Sure, their bus can go the long way around. We shouldn't have to take a bus to school. You should be driving them, you useless shit. I have to work, Joe. Work? What do you call it? Yes. Why don't you just leave my Mary alone? Because we've been married for 17 years, Joe. We have 2 children. And because we're in love with each other. Oh, fuck. I find some dirt in you, you boy. Have you people working on it?
God, Mama, you're a birthday. So are you. You should be having a lie-in though if you're on your holidays. First day of term, Sarah. Is it I? It is I. Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm not enjoying this ball. Desperate, disgusting and disgraceful. I have an appointment in Tropicana at 12, 15 minutes in the stand-up, but sure, I'll not get over the bridge at this rate. It's going to play havoc with my build-up. This is what they want. They want ordinary people to suffer. This is what it's all about. I'm pretty sure.
Okay, the opening episode of Derry Girls. And one of the things that's so enchanting for many people about the programme, and possibly so problematic, is of course that in this particular programme, the Troubles provide the backdrop for this coming-of-age story. But of course, there's a very obvious strain of nostalgia for the particular period that Lisa McGee came of age, but nostalgia, of course, for a particular moment that she came of age in the context of the Northern Irish Troubles. There's almost a kind of wistful recalling of the Troubles here, almost a kind of longing for that period when the Troubles still existed. I'm going to show you something now, which is another clip. I know one that John enjoys very much. One of the great characters here, Michelle, of course, who at least on the surface appears to be the most sexually precocious of the teenage girls. And of course, here is what was a very routine moment in Northern Irish society during the conflict, at the end of the conflict, where soldiers about to board a bus. The wee English fella, of course, hasn't seen this before and he's deeply troubled. The girls are not even vaguely interested, until, of course, Michelle almost inevitably realizes that there's a certain transgressive lure in seeing a squatty as an object of sexual desire. Anyway, enjoy this as well.
Everyone remain seated.
If I told Tom I had an incendiary device on my knickers, he'd have a look. These are our rights. I'm willing to admit it, even if nobody else will. You're a mouse. That's what you are.
Okay, Michelle at her finest. And one of the things that's, again, really, really interesting, really engaging about the programme is how the writer Lisa McGee finds fun in these everyday situations that in other countries and other contexts, not least south of the border, would have seemed deeply abnormal, but people, of course, became accustomed to in Northern Ireland. We see, for example, the attempt to flee Derry to avoid the Orange Man, but of course, leaving late. The family is trapped in the procession of men in bowler hats and sashes, and of course Grandad Joe, rather than keeping his head down, rolls down the window and issues some expletives in their direction. What we see on the right here is, of course, the figure of Emmett, the provisional IRA volunteer, who, when the family are trying to get across the border, spirits himself into the boot of the car, an attempt, of course, to flee arrest for some particular paramilitary activity he's been involved in recently. So what you see in this very, very gently humorous programme is a version of the Troubles in which a great deal of the violence is removed, which appears almost fun, which appears to be the very abnormal context in which this very normal set of adolescent preoccupations play out. There is a very obvious kind of nostalgia here, not merely for a point in one person's life, but for a moment in the society of Northern Ireland. Kim Whale, for example, in her research in the Western Cape in South Africa, talks about something strange, which is kind of intergenerational envy. She talks about how black South Africans, who are the children of people who were essentially moved into what were effectively worker concentration camps, how they are nostalgic for their parents and their grandparents' lives, how they imagine that particular time was a time of greater solidarity, of greater fairness, that people who live in a post-apartheid world are actually nostalgic for a version, that previous pre-democratic version of South African society they've heard stories about from their parents and their grandparents. And it strikes me that there are some signs of this. Derry Girls might be one of the more charming and engaging and forgivable of them, but there are signs of a certain kind of Troubles nostalgia in Northern Irish society. One is, of course, the endless retelling of the story about how punk rock ended the Troubles. Apparently when Stiffle Fingers released Inflammable Material in whatever it was, 1979, apparently all of the gunfire came to a halt. This particular moment, this mythology about Northern Ireland, trapped in amber for all posterity, of course, by Good Vibrations. But look at the opening scenes of Good Vibrations. Look at the montage of bombs going off, you know, in Botanic Avenue and Lower Donegal Street and Bedford Street. And it's almost like a family album. It's so lovingly curated. It's a setting of a scene for an international audience, but with somebody from Belfast, it's almost like a family album, a recollection of a particular moment. There's almost something that is lost in this. There's almost something to feel nostalgic about in this. Jan Carson, in her wonderful novel, The Firestarters, talks about this brilliantly, this wonderful work of magic realism I recommend to everybody, about how younger loyalists in particular are nostalgic for the, nostalgic about the war stories of their fathers and their grandfathers and the various crimes they committed in the 70s, 80s and 90s. More recently still, Glenn Patterson, in his wonderful book, Backstop Land, expresses so many misgivings. What he says about Northern Ireland, I think, is so close to our conclusion in the book. He says basically, look, it's so much better than it was before the Good Friday Agreement, but we all thought it was going to be better than this. And he talks about the perils of a kind of Troubles nostalgia. But there's so much more in Derry Girls. There's a real sharp political edge for a program that tended to be received and talked about as simply this kind of, you know, quixotic kind of local humor, and the quirks of the Derry idiom and so on. There's a real political sharpness to it. Here is a moment where the members of the family, the Quinn family, are going to satirize the 1988 Home Office ruling that meant if you wanted to hear Gerry Adams or David Irvine or whoever on the radio, on the television, their voices had to be dubbed by an actor. This is fantastic. And again, and Sarah comes to the fore.
Because of government restrictions, we cannot broadcast the voice of Mr. Adams. His words are spoken by an actor.
Well, with respect, and I mean, if you watch, I will never understand the point of it. I'll never understand the point of view. Francois.
I'll go.
Like the need to see I want to see that.
It's because his natural voice is actually very seductive. Apparently, he sounds like a West Belfast Bond. As far as English are concerned, a voice like that, well, it's dangerous.
Just so I'm clear, are you saying that the British government dubbed the voice of Gerry Adams because it's too sexy? It's like a fine whiskey. And I have nothing good authority to buy.
Perhaps not as good a satire, that particular ridiculous moment, as Brass Eye many years ago, but it communicates the point very, very well. We see the satire of the Home Office order. We see the satire also of the attempts to bring Protestant Catholic kids together, the kind of reconciliation industry, of course, in one of the episodes famously, where the kids, the Catholic girls have to meet the local Protestant boys' school. And when asked by the trendy priest, the trendy young priest that they all fancy, to fill out 2 columns, one saying the similarities between Protestants and Catholics, and the other, of course, saying the differences, that the similarities column remains glaringly empty, and of course the differences column fills up very, very quickly. Here we have Claire, of course, trying to abseil, and the fella feeding her rope is a Protestant due to a misunderstanding that come from his deafness. She thinks that he's about to drop her to her death, and she issues various phrases, not least saying, "This man's a madman, a Fenian-hating madman, don't let the Jaffa bastard hurt me, please." The term Jaffa, of course, signifying the Orange tradition in Northern Ireland, something that probably had to be explained to an international audience. Possibly the sharpest moment of satire, the darkest moment of satire, is one I've never seen anybody refer to. In the opening episode, Claire is observing a 24-hour fast, and of course, during the day she's starving and she's grumbling, and Erin in the middle wants somebody to go to the disco that night, or the gig that night, where an older fella she has an eye on is going to be organising proceedings. And Michelle, of course, on the left, Michelle, the sharp-tongued character, is fed up with Erin begging her to go to the gig, and she points towards Claire and she says, "Bring Bobby Sands there." On the 40th anniversary of his death, that is a particularly dark and bold and transgressive thing to say for somebody from Nationalist Derry to say in the pilot episode of what is supposedly a very, very disposable television programme. We're almost finished, we promise. Here's the thing that changed my mind about Derry Girls. I'm not the evangelist for the programme that John certainly is, but I watched the whole first series without really enjoying it. And then I watched the final episode and this happened. This is the final scene, or the splicing together of the 2 final scenes in the first series of Derry Girls. And it's a remarkable thing, I have to say. At the end of it, I did think I may have had something in my eye. It's actually strangely powerful in a programme that trades on humour. It is one of the darker, one of the more poignant moments in the programme. For some background here, the cousin Orla, for reasons best known to herself, has decided to make public her recently honed skills of step aerobics in the school talent contest. And the girls are looking on because everybody is mocking their friend and relative, and at the same time, the older members of the family, the 2 previous generations of the family, are gathered around the television to hear about the latest atrocity.
What's wrong with her? She's such a dick. Yeah, she might be a dick, but she's my dick. Actually, she's our dick. And all of the days and the nights, so I regret it. I never showed you my love. Oh, fuck's sake.
atrocities of the Northern Irish conflict. At least 12 people are thought to be dead and many more wounded. Emergency services are urging anyone with medical training to come to the scene immediately. The device was detonated at 3 p.m. this afternoon. The RUC no warning was given.
It strikes me there's something terribly moving about that. But there's two things that are terribly moving about that. One is, of course, the atrocity. And of course, in Northern Ireland, people like to play guess the atrocity, and people tend to think it's Oma. There's not enough people dead, and it's much too early. It might be Enniskillen, but it's you know, Enniskillen, of course, happened on the Sabbath, and this, of course, is a school day. And of course, this program is too late for that. There's something about, of course, the spectre of the past, the atrocities of the past. But there's something else that's very sad about this that struck me watching it, and certainly when rewatching it after having read Mark Fisher, which is what this program is about is not merely what we have lost, the past, what we've lost in the past. It's also about Northern Ireland's lost future. What this particular moments kind of captures is the prospect of a different Northern Ireland. The older generations, people who remember the Troubles, people who remember Bloody Sunday in the context of Derry, of course, all of the trauma they had to go through, and we're just on the cusp of the ceasefires. And of course, the young girls and their English friend, of course, are cavorting around the stage. They themselves, of course, on the verge of adulthood, on the verge of womanhood. They themselves kind of mark that transition to a different version of their own lives and the lives of the society of which they're a part. But there's something very sad about this. Watching this 27 years, 28 years on from the events that are depicted here, because we know how this movie ends. Yes, there will be peace, but the version of peace that exists in Northern Ireland is deeply, deeply problematic. There won't be a peace dividend. There won't be an economic revival. Many of these people will have to leave Derry. Derry is as underdeveloped now as it was way back then. The future that we faced was sectarian stalemate. The future that we faced was sectarian sclerosis. The future that we faced was a society in which its governing institutions went a world record number of days without actually sitting. What we faced into was the world of the Welfare Reform Act. Watching this, what this reminded me of is not merely what was lost during the Troubles, but what was lost in the transition to peace. Not merely those who died during the conflict, but that which died in the transition to peace. The prospect of a better, more prosperous, fairer Northern Ireland. Perhaps that is too strong. I want to finish there. I'm very tempted to show you another scene, which is the scene of the ceasefires themselves, which is unlike that one. That one's beautiful. This one's very, very badly handled in all sorts of ways. I'm not going to show it because we don't have time, and also because it would require us to hear the Cranberries for the second or third time today. There's been many musical atrocities committed against Northern Ireland over the years, but the Cranberry zombie that plays us out here, of course, is principal among them. Can I maybe end on something more positive? Watching Derry Girls, I'm reminded how dangerous nostalgia can be. The nostalgia, of course, is for the Troubles. It's for a time that, for all its horrors, was the place that we grew up in. For all its horrors, gave something to our lives in some strange ways. But also what I'm reminded of watching Derry Girls is our lost future, the world that could have been better, the version of Northern Ireland that could have been better. Here's an awful irony. Within 3 weeks of the broadcast of the last episode of the second series of Derry Girls, within sight of where some of the scenes had been filmed, the young woman on the left, Lara McKee, was shot dead by a stray bullet from a distant Republican. The young fella who fired the shot was 18 at the time. He was, like her, a ceasefire baby. We see on the right of the shot another form of nostalgia for Northern Ireland's troubled past. The security grill, which the Sunflower, the epicenter of hipster Belfast, the Sunflower Bar has retained. And it makes me think sometimes that the versions of nostalgia that are beginning to emerge about the Troubles are perhaps problematic, and we need to question them. That perhaps we didn't merely lose all of those people during the conflict, possibly we lost our way since the conflict. But then again, perhaps we didn't lose our future after all. Perhaps it's that young couple having to be snog in the middle of the image, the first gay couple to be married in Northern Ireland. Shawnee Edwards and Robin Peoples. And perhaps those of us of my age who remember the Troubles, who talk about a lost future, maybe are looking in the wrong place. Maybe we need to stop looking at the past and look about a proper future. Maybe we need to stop talking about politics and looking at civil society, because that's where progressive Northern Ireland is being born. Apologies, John, that went on too long. Apologies to everybody else. I hope you're still with us. Those of you who haven't slipped into a coma, be interesting to hear your questions.
Thank you, Colin, so much. Far from sending us into a coma-like state, that was a real tour de force through not just the landscape of the Troubles, but the post-agreement era, the lost futures. And I was so thrilled to see you almost ending there with your favorite band of all time, Take That. Many people don't know about your secret musical taste, but I'm very glad that's out there. World.
When Robbie left, John, talk about hauntology.
Well, look, my job is very simple at this point in time. I'm simply the compere. I'm going to ask the questions. So I would say to all of you very kind people who've tuned in and stayed, now is the opportunity to explore some of these vectors of interest and ask Colin questions. And there are some questions that have come through, and I'll begin to read them. So you can use the Q&A function on Zoom to the top of the screen if you want to send your questions through, and I will then put them to Colin. The first question from our colleague, Conrad Brunstrom. Conrad says, great talk, Colin. Anything to say about the role of James, the wee English lad? Is he some kind of mechanism, Conrad asks, for ventriloquizing English ignorance about Northern Ireland? The moment that Conrad stresses, where near the border, when James suggests, as they're sort of taking the IRA guy over the border, calling the police, unaware that there is no police, as Conrad puts it, if we define police as neutral arbiters of the rule of law, James exists, if you like, to get the stupid questions out there. And I guess I could politicize the question a little bit in saying, well, that famous moment after the 2017 election when people woke up after the counting and everybody started Googling who or what is the DUP, which I could offer all kinds of interesting answers to. But it was indicative, and is James not that stock character that is England and its relationship to Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, as always with Conrad, a brilliant question, which he then proceeded to answer, I think. I'm not sure I can put it any better than Conrad, because I wouldn't say too much other than, yeah, I mean, he is that foil, isn't he? He's the person who, you know, amid all the local eccentricities and the local idiom and the presumptions, he's the person who's outside and says, this doesn't make any sense to me. One of the nice bits is when he says, you keep on using this word we to describe things that aren't even vaguely small. You know, he is that outside character. And yeah, and I think he does ventriloquize that sense of the outsider. And the outsider in Derry is everybody, you know, everybody, you know, beyond the city, and actually, well, actually for nationalists, it's probably anybody beyond the kind of city side and the bog side.
Wouldn't you say, for example, that somebody arriving up from Kildare into Derry could be simply another version of James because they're so distant from the city and what it experienced?
Obviously, it's loaded in the sense because you already have that character. I mean, you have the Jerry, the father, who kind of performs that role. So, and James, obviously, it's much more loaded because the accent is one that could get you. I'm not saying a Southern Irish accent wouldn't draw attention, even now it would, but it might be something, an English accent, obviously, is something that could get you into trouble, which is why he's at an all-girls school. And I think he does ventriloquize that. And, you know, as I've said to many times, John, you know, ignorance of Northern Ireland isn't, you know, English people don't have a monopoly of ignorance in Northern Ireland. You know, obviously things look very different post-Brexit. It's a big topic of conversation, but it's been, and Derry Girls is one of the things that's kind of popularized it. And I mean, one of the things I would recommend to people, I read when I was doing this, Mickey Bradley, bass player of the Undertones, his autobiography, Teenage Kicks Inevitably, is just one of the funniest things I've ever read. And it's just completely different to the pattern of talk in Belfast, which is an hour's drive down the road. You know, it's a very, very specific thing. And it's much more innately humorous than Belfast is. Belfast, as I say, Belfast Girls wouldn't work in that sense.
We have another question from our colleague, Dr. Barry Cannon. Barry is on sabbatical this year. Hello, Barry. Great to have you tuning in. He says, great talk, Colin. My question, how can we disentangle the melancholia that you describe in Northern Ireland from that which is actually rooted in and caused by neoliberalism more universally? In other words, how does Northern Ireland's melancholia relate to the global hegemony of neoliberalism and, I suppose, all the pathologies that are generated by that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that's exactly right, and obviously it's something I read about quite a lot. But I mean, you know, there was meant to be a peace dividend, and it never arrived. You know, the peace dividend arrived in the lives of people who were largely sheltered from the conflict. The people who got the well-paid state jobs and lived in the leafy suburbs and all of the rest of it. And, you know, I mentioned this in the talk last week, you know, in the last 12 months, 78,000 food parcels have been distributed in Northern Ireland. If you go back to 2007, it's less than 1,000. If you go back to 2015, it's 10,000. You know, in the space since Lehman Brothers collapsed, you've had an 80-fold increase in the number of food parcels being distributed in Northern Ireland. And, you know, I'm sure you were watching it last night, John, Channel 4 News, Kneecap, West Belfast hip-hop trio, who are very, very interesting indeed. But one of the points they made...
Irish. Speaking in Irish and rapping in Irish.
Speaking in Irish, and quite often splicing the two languages together in the same sentence. But who said to the reporter is, you know, essentially that, you know, Joe Bloggs over there has exactly the same life chances as we do. And yeah, you know, I think so much of this is about poverty. I mean, one of the things of watching Derry Girls is that moment of euphoria. Maybe this is just my miserable self, but, you know, we know what's going to come after this. You can't see that without being sad about it, because there isn't going to be an employment boom. There isn't going to be multinational investment on the scale that people said that there was going to be. There isn't going to be a resolution of how we deal with the past. There's going to be so many of these problems, you know. But melancholia isn't necessarily a bad thing. Walter Benjamin, you know, famously wrote about melancholia as being one of the wellsprings of creativity, and it is in remembering the dead and recollecting the fallen that particularly people on the left might imagine a better future. I mean, I think melancholia gets a bad rap.
Another question from our colleague, Professor Mary Corcoran. Good evening, Mary. Mary says, Colin, absolutely virtuoso performance. Thank you for this riveting exploration of hauntology. And I should say that before this, I had read Colin's piece in a journal called Television and New Media, which uses hauntology to explore these themes, and it's absolutely brilliant, I think. She says, you've opened up a whole new vista of thinking about Northern Ireland for me. Is there evidence that proportionately more young people are leaving Ireland now than in the 1990s? I guess in the period that Derry Girls is actually set, and the first decade of the 2000s. And has there been a Brexit effect on young people's migratory choices?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about migration in Northern Ireland is it's a peculiar thing, because the people who leave Northern Ireland are disproportionately Protestant and well-to-do, certainly in terms of whatever it is, the 9,000 or 10,000 people who go to British universities every autumn, they're disproportionately middle-class Protestants. So what we've had actually, strangely, is a slow drift out of the 6 counties of unionists from more well-to-do backgrounds. It's one of the many kind of counterintuitive things about the place. Actually, I mean, another strange thing is Northern Ireland has, for the last 3 years, had the lowest unemployment rate in the UK. I mean, who would have thought that? But the reason for that is that there's so many people on disability, what used to be called disability living allowance, twice the level at any other region of the UK, because of the conflict, that they don't feature in the unemployment statistics. You know, so I mean, that is one of the things you need to remember when talking about a place like Northern Ireland. You know, but it's one of the peculiarities that quite often it's middle class Protestants who leave and they don't come back. 80% of people who go across the water university are from unionist backgrounds. 80% of them never come back. I mean, I did the back of the envelope calculation, and there's probably 150,000 Protestants born in Northern Ireland living across the water. You know, it's a very, very, but again, it's indicative of something. It's a lack of confidence, a lack of a sense of the future.
And is it the same, say, for nationalist Catholics who come south, maybe, you know, to live or work in Dublin or to study in the Republic? Are those patterns the same, that people, when they come, they tend to stay, or do they go back?
I couldn't really answer that, John, to be honest with you. I mean, one of the things that's very interesting is the relatively small numbers of people who are crossing the border in terms of higher education. I mean, not least in Maynooth. Maynooth has 10 students from 6 counties out of 13 or 14,000. I mean, UCD and Trinity and so on have much higher numbers, but that traffic is much less than you might imagine, you know?
Yeah. I have another question from Iveta Yusova, and she says, thank you, such a wonderful lecture. My question has to do with the Donegal episode, which we featured. I love the show, says Iveta, but the representation of the student of color in that episode is a bit disturbing, and I don't know what to make of it. What's your reading of this episode? I guess there's a broader issue about the new Northern Ireland, the people who have come to live in Northern Ireland, and if they are people of color, how are they treated, and so on.
That's a complicated question. I mean, that episode is the second last of the second series, which is the one that has the ceasefires on it. And the news of the ceasefires being broadcast intercuts with the final scene, which is the Carrie scene of the wee girl, the wee swat, who's not particularly liked, who wins kind of homecoming queen kind of accolade, being drenched in fake blood. So they're kind of spliced together in that. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think the representation, it's the representation, I suppose, of an older version of Irish stroke Northern Irish comedy, of people who probably grew up in what were almost exclusively white neighborhoods, not quite knowing to do how to bring a character like that in. I agree with the question. It's not particularly well handled because, of course, it's based upon this assumption, this very old assumption, that this is in itself comic, that somebody looks a bit different is of itself comic. In terms of what's happened in Northern Ireland, you know, 1 in 9 people in Northern Ireland at the last census were born outside the 6 counties. Now, more than half of those are from these islands, but you now have a very, very multicultural society, much less than south of the border. But one of the many things that was interesting was in just over a year ago, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Belfast and Derry, which, if you look at the footage on YouTube, those were people, as you might imagine, with Belfast and Derry accents, because there were people born in Northern Ireland or whose families moved when they were very, very small. And there's always been ethnic minorities in Northern Ireland. You know, there was a Chinese community when I was a kid, there was a Vietnamese community when I was a kid, there was a Jewish community, an Indian community, but it looks very, very different now. And one of the things that was very, very striking about that was that quite often anti-racism activism involves, you know, in the past in Northern Ireland has involved white lefties and so on. Here you had young, dark-skinned people with Northern Irish accents, very much to the fore. And of course, what does the state do to them? What does the police do to them? It actually gives them criminal records. It fines them. Of course, you know, obvious point of contrast is the Bobby Story funeral, among many other things. But there's a documentary that's been coming out for several months now called Black and Northern Irish, which is very much look forward to. But yeah, it's a very different looking society now, and it's a lot healthier for it.
This question, I think, is connected, and it comes from our colleague, Dr. Breed Connolly, who says, absolutely wonderful talk, Colin. Thank you. Is Northern Ireland emerging from the kind of theocratic duopoly of the two polarized communities, or, and I'm sure this is probably a reference to recent events, which we covered last time in our Northern Ireland F100 talk, are we about to plunge back into the worst of that period again?
That's more than one question, but in terms of, thanks very much, Breed. It's great to hear from you, and thanks for coming to the talk. Theocratic, you have a huge generational rift in Northern Ireland now. Again, we talked about this last week, so I won't dwell on it too much, which is that Northern Ireland is secularizing very, very fast. The number of people who go to church at least twice a month now is around a third in both Protestant and Catholic communities. If you went back to the day Bobby, the Sunday after Bobby Sands died, 90% plus Catholics said they were at Mass, 50% plus of Protestants said that they were in the various places of worship. This is a heavily secularized society. It's a society in which younger people say they're pro-gay marriage, they're pro-abortion, they're pro, every other liberal thing that you might imagine. And as Pete Sherlow was saying last week, he's banging this drum for a while. The most liberal people in Northern Ireland, if opinion polls can be believed, are young Protestants who don't vote. And this is the thing. There's a disconnect between the unionist parties, or certainly the principal unionist party, and some of those people whose votes they think they can presume to get. They're not going to get them. And it's an embarrassment. I mean, I don't want to get too vitriolic about this, but it's an embarrassment. The prospect that somebody like Edwin Poots could be the leader of what remains the largest party in the assembly is,
yes,
climate change. People who believe that homosexuality is some kind of hereditary curse, and people who, it's just absolutely astounding. But it's Northern Ireland has changed so much. They're so out of step.
Yeah, I was amazed to find that the world is less than 4,000 years old when I looked at some of the material on Mr. Poots. Extraordinary.
Well, that's what I would say to people. There's these, people, every time sometimes, and I know this world because it's the world I grew up in. As a teenager, the only places, midwinter, the only places to go to shelter from the rain and have a game of football were evangelical church halls. I know the world, and I have a lot of respect for a lot of people who come through that tradition. But the version that Poots represents, the anti-homosexuality, the kind of anti-abortion, this stuff about, Jesus had a pet dinosaur when he was a wee lad, all this stuff.
And it's extraordinary as well because, of course, one of the storylines, the most powerful ones of Derry Girls, is Claire and her coming out at the end of, I think it's the first series. And if you think about the timeline, and we could have a new First Minister in Northern Ireland who believes the things that he does, that you've just described.
It's extraordinary, and also the thing about it is that because the DUP are so extraordinarily anachronistic, it sometimes draws attention away from the fact that historically Sinn Féin haven't put a huge amount of energy into LGBT rights. Obviously have been deeply ambivalent on the issue of abortion until the kind of momentum behind Repeal the Eighth meant that it was a surefire winner. Sinn Féin's kind of record on this is less than pristine as well.
I have about 3 more questions, if you'll just bear with me. I'm absolutely delighted to hear from our former colleague, Professor Erhan Dogan, who was a good friend of Emre, and he thanks us for commemorating Emre in this way. Erhan has just gone to Uzbekistan on a fieldwork trip, and the identity issues there, in particular concerning Russia, whether you're a Russophile or phobic, come into play. And he says that the conclusion is simple: you see what you look for. And where identity politics is concerned. But he says, if we do not focus on power relations and we separate out the society from the power relations, we really can't understand all the pathologies. So I suppose he's asking this question about power in any kind of conflict society. in any society where identity is polarized, and how much those power relations really matter.
Yeah, it's fantastic to hear from Erhan. Merhaba, Erhan, it's a delight. I just remember one Friday afternoon, you and Emre, in one of Mick Wallace's restaurants. It's an afternoon I won't forget. It's certainly an afternoon my liver won't forget, and it's fantastic to hear from you. Hopefully I'll see you some other time. Yeah, it's true, but the thing about it is, one of the problems in Northern Ireland is, and again, I could give you a very long-winded answer to this, but one of the problems with how we talk about Northern Ireland is quite often we're constantly talking about Stormont, we're constantly talking about the kind of political battle lines between and within parties and so on. And of course, one of the things that's become increasingly obvious in Northern Ireland is that the Good Friday Agreement, you know, as people said at the time, institutionalizes ethno-national politics, because on certain matters, at least, there has to be weighted majorities of unionists and nationalists that vote in favor of certain pieces of legislation. The problem with that is 23 years ago, that made a certain amount of sense. A generation down the line, does it still make sense? In a world where the Life and Time survey tells us that at least a third, possibly in some years, as much as a half of people don't regard themselves as unionists and nationalists. So the people who those people vote for, who are others in certain key moments, don't really matter. So what you have is a political system that, of course, essentially has, you know, that looked like a reasonable palliative to an ethnically divided society, has put that divided society into a straitjacket. And one of the reasons I kind of mentioned the stuff about kind of civil society at the end is it just strikes me every time I have to read about or think about or hear about Northern Irish politics at that big political level, it depresses the life out of me. Anytime I, you know, watch something on YouTube about a band, every time I read, you know, John Carson or Carrie Doherty or Anna Burns or whoever it happens to be, I see a different version of Northern Irish society, one that is multicultural and one in which women are very, very much to the fore. So I agree with Erhan, but the problem is, in much of mainstream commentary, we hear so much of that big power politics and so little of what's going on in the spaces of civil society. And
you could argue the political system since '98 just reinforces that ethno-national divide.
It absolutely does. And I think it's one of the reasons, like, I mean, if you go back to, what was it, the 2015 Westminster elections, 3/4 of 18 to 24-year-olds didn't vote. In the 2019 election, 53% of them didn't vote. You know, there's a huge disconnect. I mean, again, NECAP were talking about this last night. You know, that this version of politics doesn't make any sense to us. It's deeply disconnected. It's deeply dysfunctional. And it's a version of a society that Northern Ireland has shed its skin over the last 23 years. You know, but then that assembly sometimes resembles the version of the society that I grew up in. It's not the version of the society that my niece is growing up in. You know, it's just not.
There's a question that comes neatly out of that from our colleague and friend, Dr. Niall Gilmartin, who is your co-author on this new book that's coming out with Manchester. And Niall says, thanks for a great talk, Colin. Many prevailing accounts of the Troubles, he argues, are perhaps understandably actor-centric and focus on the protagonists themselves and those directly affected by the violence. And he mentions Anna Burns' Milkman, Booker Prize-winning novel, wonderful as it is. Derry Girls, he says, demonstrates the layers of Northern Irish society whose lives may have been deeply impacted by the violence, even though they may not have been directly victims of the Troubles and of the violence. Rather than being a nostalgia for the past, he asks, is Derry Girls and other cultural outputs a way of attempting to make sense of that past, precisely because the Good Friday Agreement deliberately and strategically issued it? I guess here we're talking about what some people call the creative ambiguity of the agreement, that, you know, it allowed people to be British or Irish or neither or both or whatever. But in the same way, it made it more difficult, in a sense, to actually engage with the traumas, very real traumas of the past.
Absolutely, and I suppose that slide that I put up from Avery Gordon. It's a very oblique way of saying, I think, what Niall has said. To put it in kind of in these terms, you can't give up the ghost. It doesn't leave you. It's still there. And this was the problem with that attempted cauterization. You know, Niall will know this much better than I do. I mean, one of his chapters in the book is precisely about memory and how we've dealt with the troubles, which we haven't. We simply haven't. You know, the mechanisms, I mean, other than occasional tribunals, some of which are hugely important, the Savile Tribunal obviously being the most important, that moment of political exorcism was hugely important. But there is no system here. There is no program for dealing for dealing with this. And it's kind of, I suppose, I don't want to use a term like the return of the repressed, because I'm probably using it psychoanalytically wrongly, but it's the fact that we have stored up problems for ourselves. And one of the things when I was watching all these TV programs, these movies, I was thinking, this is a problem that simply will not go away. And this is one of the places through which, this is one of the media through which it expresses itself. And I think Niall's right. I think it is a making sense of things, but there's also, and I don't want to be too hard on this, and I probably sounded harder than I was because I was kind of mindful of time, trying to kind of cut a few corners at the end. But, you know, we're all nostalgic to the lesser or greater extent. And nostalgia's original meaning is homesickness. You know, and anybody who's moved or been dislocated is homesick. Now is doing research on people who are burnt out of their homes at the beginning of the Troubles. I mean, nostalgia is baked into us in all sorts of different ways. I just think that there's different versions of it. And Derry Girls is a very innocent version. I've no necessarily problem with it, but it's part of something greater, which is us trying to work out what the Troubles were about, what its legacies are, how we deal with them, who we were back then. But it's also about autobiography. It's also about growing up in the street or neighborhood that you did, you know, so yeah.
Well, I forgot to say, I love the fact that as academics, we can watch television series for months on end and films and describe it as work. It's extraordinary.
The thought did cross my mind, John. I'm sitting in the tea in my jammies, you know, watching back episodes of The Fall.
I have a very good question from Dr. Jonathan Evershed, and Jonathan has done a lot of work on unionism, in particular in recent years, in the Brexit context and others. And he says, thanks, Colin, that was brilliant. I was wondering whether you had anything to say about the ways in which unionism and loyalism are haunted. I'm also interested in whether and how you think loyalist iterations of melancholia are related to, but distinct from, what Paul Gilroy describes as post-colonial melancholia in wider British contexts, British landscapes, and British political culture.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's funny because I was just asked to write a wee piece about Tom Nairn's The Breakup of Britain that's being reissued by Verso, and of course first published in 1977. Essays that were written in the late 1960s, early to mid 1970s, and that sense that post-imperial melancholia is all pervasive, I think, within unionism. I mean, at a base level, one of the many things that's interesting, there's I think a distinction, which is a big generalization. There's a distinction, say, for example, one of the things that's really interesting about former loyalist paramilitaries is how many of them found God, right? How many couldn't reconcile what they had done, reconcile themselves with what they had done? How many in prison found God? Is that a phenomenon among Republicans? I mean, I certainly haven't heard of it. There does seem, I'm sure, you know, people are haunted by what they've seen, what they've done, and so on. But there's, I mean, you know, in over the years, I've met so many of these figures who have turned to God as some kind of substitute, so some palliative to kind of cure their guilt for what they did. But it doesn't strike me that in the Republican community that's ever necessarily been a problem on the same scale. There was always an ideological context and a way of explaining things and justifying things, and so on. It's also the nature of loyalist violence. A lot of it was up close and personal in a way which Republican violence wasn't. I think he's right. I mean, the thing that's palpable, you know, is you know, the soundtrack. Watching wee bits of Hunger yesterday. The soundtrack would be perfect for filming some of the communities that are attempting to mobilize against the protocol. Because one of the many things that is so pointless about contemporary loyalism and unionism is they keep on setting themselves objectives that they can never reach. You know, they set about political projects that can only end in failure. And there is something deeply, deeply despondent, melancholy about unionism. I think there's an air of defeat about it, and has been for as long as I can remember. So yeah, I think it is precisely there of.
We are drawing. Thanks so much. We are drawing towards the end. I have another question from our colleague, Dr. Chandana Mathur. Chandana says, fantastic talk, Colin. Any thoughts about how the overlapping of Derry Girls, and I presume Chandana means when it was being shown by Channel 4, with how the Brexit negotiations were playing out, did that affect the way in which the show was received, do you think?
I don't know how to answer the question. It's an interesting question, but I don't know how to answer the question, because of course it's set in a previous era where people's
at Maynooth. I'm very, very grateful to everybody who has tuned in this evening. I think we really had a tour de force politics, but the multiple and intersecting ways in which the Troubles intersects with the present in so many contexts and instances. So we're extremely grateful. It is our last event, effectively, of the year, and it was a wonderful way to end. And the other thing that I take from this talk is watch more television. Why not?
I say this to students all the time, John. They look at me, but precisely. Can I also just say, because I did forget to say this earlier, thanks a million to Orla and to Anne from MUSSI, who not for the first time have been absolutely fantastic in facilitating this. So I really want to appreciate them. It's a shame that we're doing an Emery Memorial Lecture, in the sense that I wish he were still with us, but it's great that we're able to do this. And hopefully around this time next year, we can do something more convivial in person that involves us decamping to a local hostelry. And I think that would be a more appropriate way of marking the great man's name in memory. But thanks also to you, John, for hosting and for encouraging me to do this.
Well, thank you so much. Well, here is to Emre. I'm
on the dry, unfortunately, but
greatest affection.
Other times.
And we'll return to this again in the future. Thanks very much to you, Colin, and thanks very much to everybody who stayed with us over the course of the last 2 hours. Thank you and good night.
Cheers, John.